Here's the good news. We know something that is too good not to share. Jesus is in the business of making heaven on earth, right here, right now. And only together can we invite every generation to experience the love and grace of Jesus, which is making lives whole, making families strong, and making our community new. Right here, right now, and that's good news.
Hey, everybody. Good to see you. In case you're wondering, yes, that was a Dumb and Dumber reference that Pastor Harry made, the salmon of Capistrano. What is wrong with you people? We're really doing it, Harry. We're really Oh, man. Hey, if you are new with us, or you're just joining us for the first time in a long time, or you're back with us for the first time in a long time, we are coming to the end of a series called Only Together. And we've been walking through some concepts, really, to talk about a new day at our church. So we're really looking at the old days of the church from 2,000 years ago, of what this thing called the church was supposed to be, and where we want our church to go in alignment with what the church, when this thing called the church got started 2,000 years ago. Last week, we said, in case you missed it, we said that in the first century world, when Peter, Paul, the disciples began to hear about this thing called the church, their construct of what church was a sacred place, that there was a sacred place in Jerusalem. It took 46 years to build. It was called the temple. The temple was divine real estate. The belief was God actually took up residence inside of the temple, that inside the holiest of holy place, that this was the house of God. We say that about church a lot. Well, it's the house of God. Wear your Sunday best. But this was literally the house of God. God had chosen to take up residence in a divine place. That was what they thought of when they thought of church. We said that there was a divine person, or a sacred person was the way we said it. There's a sacred place, there was a sacred person. The sacred person was the high priest. They were sort of like the president and the chief justice and the Senate, all kind of rolled into one. They were the highest moral authority. The religious experience 2,000 years ago, the church experience 2,000 years ago, was a pretty passive experience for people like you and me. You just sort of outsourced the whole thing to a priest. He offered the special prayers. He did the animal sacrifices. We don't do that anymore, by the way. But he sort of did all the sacred work, and you just tried to be a good moral person. We said there was a sacred place, there was a sacred person, there was also a sacred set of practices. If you've ever read through the Old Testament, Leviticus, Exodus, Moses, that guy, all the thou shalts, the 10 commandments, those were sacred practices that you devoted yourself to try to keep. And the whole thing was just sacred practices, sacred person, sacred place, and you just repeated the calendar every year based on those three things. And the disciples recognized when Jesus launched this thing called the church, Peter, Paul, these guys, they began to realize that Easter drew a line in the sand, that something new was happening in the world. And Peter, the way we said it last week, was he recognized the whole system of sacred person, sacred place, sacred practices had been flipped on its head, and that there was a new sacred place, and it wasn't a piece of land in Jerusalem, that there was a new sacred place, and it's you and it's me, that you're now the place where God has chosen to take up residence, that you're the temple of God. You are the house of God. He's chosen to take up residence in people, not in a particular piece of property in Jerusalem. You're the temple. You're as divine real estate as there is walking through the city today. You didn't know that about yourself, but that's true of you, and it's true of me. There's no longer a sacred person. We said last week that everybody is a sacred person, that we're all priests, essentially. If you missed last week, we all became priests. You can get your certificate online, but that was sort of one of the highlights of my week was standing in the candy aisle at CVS, and this nice lady comes up to me and she says, "Pastor Jared?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm Pastor Marcia." It's the highlight, man, I'm telling you. It's great. It's just great. And then I said, "Will you buy me a Kit Kat, Pastor?" She put her cigarette out on, no, anyway. A whole new thing. We're no longer defined by sacred place. We're all sacred places. We're no longer defined by sacred person. Everybody's a sacred person. We're all priests. We all have work to do. The sacred practice is not bring your best animal for sacrifice. It's bring your best act of love. That's what God is interested in this new thing called the church. That's what it's supposed to be. And so we just began looking at that together. And if you forget everything else I have said throughout the course of this series, if you forget everything else that we talk about today, Jesus is going to reduce this whole thing down to one word. We're going to talk about this one word together today. But it's a critique on the old way things used to be. The old system, sacred place, sacred person, sacred practices, the law, it was a fear-based system. If you've ever read through Leviticus, Exodus, you know it's don't eat this. If you do, you die. Don't go there. If you do, you die. Don't associate with them. They're unclean. If you do, you'll die. I mean, that was sort of the whole thing. It was a fear-based system. And fear, it has its purposes. Fear is great at controlling people. But here's the problem. Fear is terrible at changing people, isn't it? Fear is terrible at actually changing the human heart. And so Jesus, when he's asked one day, this new thing you're doing, this whole new sort of system that you're setting up, what's it based in? What are we supposed to remember? And this is the conversation. Jesus is going to reduce it to one word that always has to remain central for the church. If you have a Bible, Matthew chapter 22, starting in verse 36 is where we are going to begin. If you don't have a Bible, we place these verses on the screens, and that's a great place to follow along as well. It says this, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" So in the old system, they're saying we're still bound to the old system. If you've ever read through Exodus, Leviticus, and you thought, well, this is really bizarre. I mean, are we supposed to, some of those verses in there, I mean, if your child is unruly, stone them. I mean, these are sort of, that's not the new mission of the church, by the way. But there's verses like that in there. I mean, if it's your enemy, you can, go to war against your, there's all these verses. You and I are not bound to that covenant. That was a covenant that God made with a nation, the nation of Israel. We read it because it's true, but it's not our covenant. Our covenant is the New Testament, where God has made an arrangement, not with a nation, but with all nations through Jesus. That all people can come to God. The New Testament, this new thing Jesus is saying, this is what it boils down to. Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. So there's 600 plus laws in the old thing. He says, this is the new thing. Love God. This, verse 38, he says, this is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. So he plucks the two that sort of frame the whole thing. He says, these are the most two. Love God, love people. All the law and prophets, and they didn't call it the Old Testament. They just called it the law and the prophets, hang on these two commandments. If you forget everything else I said, Jesus says, if you forget everything else that you've ever read, heard, and sure, if you forget it all, this is the bottom line. Love God and love people. Love God and love people. And the old thing was easy. It was just rules, commands, the lines were clearly drawn. This new thing based in love is complicated. You know this. If anybody in this room is married, you know this thing called love is complicated. If you've ever tried to love a person, if you've loved a friend, if you ever tried to love a dog, it's complicated. Like if you have a cat that you love, it's complicated. It's just, that's the nature of love. It pulls us into awkward, gray, it's less defined. That's the very purpose of this new thing that Jesus came to establish. Love demands, requires, pulls us in directions that it often gets messy. It's more complicated. Often there's not a clear-cut answer on what we're supposed to do when we're navigating the waters of grace and truth. But this new thing Jesus is inviting us into, it's often awkward, and it's supposed to be. Love, that's just the nature of love. We said a couple of weeks ago, there's a new mission statement. Harry talked about it a few moments ago. We want to invite every generation to experience the love and grace of Jesus as lives are made whole. as families are made strong, as our community is made new. And that's a beautiful goal, but it can begin to be a very awkward goal. It's difficult. There's not a clear-cut path for 5 objectives of how you do that. I mean, when you begin to invite people to experience the love and grace of Jesus, I mean, you know this, you're dealing with broken people and broken stories and trying to figure out how the love and grace of Jesus, interacts with that. It invites awkward, messy, grace, truth, love. I mean, it's just a more difficult endeavor. It would be easier in the old system just to throw rules and regulations instead of love and grace in people's directions. When you begin to invite the love and grace of Jesus into your family, that can be awkward. Trying to figure out, how do I give grace to a son or daughter? How do I give truth to a daughter? This thing of love, it's awkward. Some of us, you know this because your family puts the fun in dysfunctional. Anybody else? Yeah. That's just the nature of what love does. It's awkward. It pulls us. It drags us into those waters. Loving our community. If a church is to love its community and leverage what it has to benefit those outside the walls of the church, that's awkward at times. There's not always clear-cut answers on how to solve social problems in our community. It'd be easier to say we're just kind of a holy huddle and good luck to the rest of the world. But when you begin to leverage what you have in love for your city and community, that becomes awkward. The old thing was a lot cleaner and easier to do. The old system essentially would have said, this should be your mission statement as a church. We want to terrify every generation with rules and regulations so that people are made ashamed, families are made judgmental, and our community is made skeptical. That's the goal. That was my first go at it, and Nate and Harry and some people got involved and cleaned it up a little bit. That would be way easier to do, wouldn't it? Some of us, I mean, if you're honest, you grew up in a church like that. Nobody hung it on the wall, but that was sort of the unspoken goal of the whole thing. They're unclean, we're better, their sin makes us superior. If they can't play by the rules, this is why a lot of times churches begin to feel a lot like country clubs, don't they? If they can't play by the rules, this new thing, it's this love-based thing. This is awkward. This gets messy. This gets, now, you notice this with Jesus and the disciples. These are good, God-fearing Hebrew Jewish guys who their whole life, they're unclean. Now they're being dragged to the dinner table with the unclean in the presence of Jesus. This is what love does. This is what love demands, and this is how love begins to live itself out. It's awkward. It's supposed to be. That's the very nature of love. If a church ever forgets love, if something other than love moves to the top of the agenda for a church, which happens all the time, it becomes irrelevant in its city and it becomes irrelevant in its community. If something besides love moves to the top of the agenda item, where something besides love, loving people, becomes the main focus of a church, all of a sudden it will become irrelevant. If the church at Rancho Bernardo is to ever become an irrelevant church in this community and city, it's not going to be because we run short on people. It's not going to be because we run short on money. It's going to be because we begin to run short on love. And somewhere along the way, if we ever become irrelevant in this city, it's because love took a back seat to something else. And that's why Jesus is awkward, as much as it pulls us into waters where we don't even know the answer, the outcome oftentimes. He says love over and over again has to be the main thing. If a church ever gets out of the love business, it essentially just goes out of business. Love has to be the thing over and over again that a church says, this is our mission. If you forget everything else, you boil it down to this one thing. How do we love people well? This is the whole thing. This is why I think Jesus, Peter, Paul, the architects of the New Testament, the architects of the church, remind people over and over again, love, it's about love, it's about love. This is the whole thing. Notice what Jesus says to his disciples, John 13, and we place these on the screens. You can follow along there, verse 34. A new command, he says, I give to you. A new command, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. If you what? Love one another. He doesn't say they will know you as my disciples by your beliefs, does he? That would be way easier. No, it's by your love for one another. Love has to remain at the top of the agenda, or a church becomes irrelevant, and it's if a church isn't in the love business, then it just essentially has gone out of business. This has to be the main focus. He says, love one another. This is how they will know that you're attached to this Jesus thing, by how well you love one another. And if you've read the story, you know what he's just done. He's just washed their feet. How awkward is that? And then he says, I want you to love each other as I have loved you, which if I'm in that circle, I'm going, you want me to wash somebody's feet? I mean, that's just, I'd rather grab a sword than a towel, man. That's just, that's awkward. And these are men's feet, by the way. These are Mediterranean, first century guys' feet that he's washing. I mean, this is awkward. This is the nature of what love does. It invites the awkward. It pulls us. It drags us into uncomfortable places with uncomfortable people and uncomfortable moments. That's just the nature of love. Notice what Peter says. He's the guy that's the rock. If you were here last week, he's the guy that's sort of the cornerstone of the church, that Jesus says, okay, you're the rock, Peter. And he says, I'm the living stone. I'm the main stone, but Peter, you're pretty crucial to what we're doing here. And Peter is trying to find words for the first century church and saying this whole thing has got to reduce down to one thing. And he says this, above all, verse 4, or verse 8 of 1 Peter 4, he says, above all, I want you to what? What does it say? Love. Love each other deeply. In the old system, animal sacrifices covered a multitude of sins. In the old system, rituals, practices, that was how you covered a multitude of sins. In the new thing, love covers over a multitude of sins. Love is what covers wrongdoing. This new thing has to be based and built in love. That's the whole thing. Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, Paul, who was sort of the first person to hoist a sail and start going around the Roman Empire. He says this to the church at Corinth, and I love the way that he is inspiring the church at Corinth. I mean, if you ever read the letter, he's basically beating them up a little bit. I mean, he starts off the letter, he's like, dear Corinthians, stop this, start doing this, don't do this anymore. This group of people needs to stop, he just goes on. And then he's sort of like, love Paul, sort of the end of it. But he says this as he's getting to the end of his first letter to the Corinthians. He says, and now, where are we? Oh, Galatians. We'll get back to Corinthians. That'll come at some moment. We'll get there. He says this to the church at Galatia. He says, you, my brothers and sisters, he says, you were called to be free. Free from what? Free from the law, free from the old thing. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. In other words, now that you don't have the law hanging over your head, that doesn't mean just do whatever you want. He says, in this new thing, I want you to serve one another humbly in what? For the entire law, the whole thing. He said, you can sum it up one way. It's in this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. He even truncates what Jesus says and says, it's got to be about loving people. It can't just be about loving an invisible God. It has to be about loving people. This has to be the main focus, the heart of what a church is supposed to be. If you forget everything else, Galatia, if you forget everything else, Ephesus, this one thing of love has to remain at the top of the agenda. And why this matters so much is because when churches forget this, you've experienced this, many of us in this room, if you were to talk about church, this is how you begin to think about church and the way that it's supposed to be. When churches forget this, it just drifts back into the old system, doesn't it? And it becomes about a sacred place. It becomes about a sacred place. Some of us, you grew up in churches where the building was more important than the people outside of the building. It becomes about don't chew gum in the building. It comes about, wear your Sunday best to the building. All that's fine and good, but it can quickly revert back. If love is not at the top of the agenda, often the building becomes at the top of the agenda. The old system, the sacred place system, oftentimes it becomes about the priest or the person that's on stage. Oftentimes we begin to think of the person that speaks the most as the most holy or sacred person. I remember about 15 years ago when I was at the very first church that I was at, I was talking with somebody and they said, well, hey, you're a pastor. I said, yeah. They said, hey, we just bought this new house. Would you come over and anoint our house? I thought, what in the world? So I showed up and was sort of like, room 1, room 2, sort of faked my way through it, But there begins to be that kind of a relationship, like there's a sacred person. This is why when I talk to my neighbors just a normal conversation in the driveway, and they're just swearing like every other word, and then they'll be like, so what do you do? I run a golf club, like now. Oh, you're a pastor. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to swear in front of you. It's okay. It's okay. There's not a sacred person. The pastor's not elevated. We're all if a church ever forgets this, it just drifts back into the old thing. It becomes about the person on stage, the sacred, the whole. No, it's got to be about love. It has to be about the act of love in terms of what your sacrifices are. Often we start asking, what are the new spiritual practices? What are the new sort of sacred things that we're supposed to do? And often some of us, you grew up in church environments like that, where this is what Christians do. This is how long Christians pray. These are the colored pencils Christians are supposed to, buy. And this is the version of the scriptures that Christians are supposed to read. And, none of that, NLT, no, we want this version. It's got to be the HGTV version, whatever. It's got to be, it becomes about, the practices, and it misses the whole point. And the church has a long history of completely missing the point of love. This happened to Peter. Peter's the guy who says, you're the sacred place. You're the sacred people. There's not divine real estate. There's not a sacred person. And within a couple centuries, Peter, if you know his story, he goes to Rome, and he's one of the guys who's the architect of the church in Rome, the headquarters of the Roman Empire. And what do? A couple centuries after Peter dies? They make him the first pope, for crying out loud. They make him the sacred person. And then, nothing against it, I get it, but they essentially, if you've ever been to Vatican City, they bury Peter in the ground, and then they just build the Vatican, a massive holy site on top of his body. I don't know, maybe it's just me. I think Peter, something in him looks down over heaven. He's going, you missed it. You're the sacred people. It's not a sacred place. If I get a hat, then the rest of you get a hat. Everybody, we all have to be in this thing together. That's the whole point. And it has to be about love. If it's about something else, if it's about a sacred person, a sacred place, sacred practices, we miss the whole thing. Love has to be about love. We said last week there were some images for us as a church of how we keep the main thing of love the main thing. These 3 images of the door, the table, the garden. For us as a church, this is just a healthy tension for us as a church to remind ourselves over and over again that it's our responsibility to love people in whatever stage of life or stage of faith that they're in. Sometimes it's the door, sometimes it's the table, and sometimes it's the garden. And we invite people at various stages of faith. To be loved in different ways. All of these are different ways of loving people in whatever stage of faith they're in. Sometimes it's the door. And as a church, we want to be defined by an open door. As an open door policy that says that Jesus is for everyone. That Jesus loves everyone, that nobody is disqualified from the grace of God. Nobody's bad behavior is disqualifying them today from the grace of God. Nobody gets the closed door treatment at the church at Rancho Bernardo. Because what you see when you read the stories of Jesus, Jesus is for everyone. He's eating with everybody. He's inviting everybody to walk through the door, regardless of past, regardless of behaviors. Jesus is for everyone. And so as a church, we want to be defined as individuals, as open doors for people that love and give grace to people. But we also, as a church, want to be defined by an open door, a big, fat, open door that says anybody is welcome. Nobody's perfect, but anybody's welcome. And if Jesus isn't good news for everybody, then he's not good news for anybody. If somebody's bad behavior has disqualified them from the presence of Jesus, then your bad behavior at some point, my bad behavior at some point has done the same thing. He's good news for everyone. He's an open door for everyone. And people begin to experience the love and grace of Jesus an invisible God, the invisible God, when they begin to experience love and grace from you and from me as visible people. What that looks like at a practical level, at the most practical possible level, the way that begins to work itself out is that we accept, we love people. Acceptance is so powerful. This is true whether you're a Christian or not. Your heart and my heart naturally gravitates towards environments and people of acceptance. You naturally gravitate in the direction of open door people, people that accept you, that love you. That's just the way the human heart works. Your heart is naturally repelled by environments or people of rejection, isn't it? It's naturally going to be repelled by people that give you just a little bit of a closed door. If you just sniff that out a little bit and all of a sudden you feel rejection, you walk away from those environments, you walk away from those kinds of people. The human heart gravitates towards people of love and acceptance. That's just how we're all built and wired. This is why some of us, you have a teenager, a teenage daughter, a teenage son, that you wish like crazy you could pry away from a group of friends. In fact, that's the only reason you're at church, because you're trying to get them in youth group with some other, Christian, friends. You just want them away from a group of friends. And you can't, because that group of friends that's influencing them in the wrong direction love and accept them the way that they are. And they're the biggest open door in their life. And so they had access to their heart because they accepted them. It's just the way the human heart is wired. It's just a principle. Love paves the way to influence. That's just what love does. It paves the way to influence. You cannot hate somebody and influence them at the same time. Have you ever noticed that? Politicians try to do it all the time. I hate you, I can't stand you, and by the way, I need everything about your politics to change. It just doesn't work. You can't influence somebody without loving and giving them acceptance. It's just the nature of love. It paves the way to influence. If there's somebody that you're trying to influence in your life right now, you begin to love that person, you'll begin to influence that person. What did Jesus do over and over again? When he wanted to influence people, he loved people. He ate with people. He invited all the awkward to the table over and over again. It's just what love does. It influences people. When God wanted to influence you when you were far away from God, what did God throw in your direction? Rules and regulations? No. Love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And in the process of loving you, isn't it true? This is true for all of us. Love began to influence you in the direction God wanted you to go. Love paves the way to influence. And so as a church, we're defined by this, love and acceptance for people, because Jesus was defined by this, love and acceptance for people. The old system was a lot easier. The old system said literally there are certain people who have behaved their way away from God. And you can be a closed door to certain people. The rules, the regulations, that's the line in the sand. And certain people, they have behaved their way away from God, and you don't have to be an open door for them. The old system said other people's sins make you superior as a person, and you can close the door. This new thing says, doesn't matter who they are, you have to love that person. If it's your neighbor, love your neighbor. If it's your enemy, love your enemy. If it's somebody from a different generation, love them. If it's somebody with different preferences, different beliefs, you love that person. And what you discover in the process of loving your enemy and loving your neighbor is that you begin to influence your enemy, you begin to influence your neighbor at the same time. That's what Jesus demonstrates over and over again, and that's the power of what love begins to do. We're defined by an open door as a church. This is the kind of community that we see Jesus model over and over again. And you can hang out at the front door of the church at Rancho Bernardo as long as you need to. Some of us, you've been coming here for a long time and you're asking questions about God. You're trying to figure out this whole love, grace, Jesus thing, and you can hang out at the front door as long as you need to, but eventually we want to invite you beyond the door to the table. The table is the place of grace and of truth, where we start giving grace and telling the truth to each other, because God loves you just the way that you are, but he refuses to leave you that way. Have you ever noticed that before? This is not the place of, we just need to tell those people the truth. No, this becomes the place where we begin to have those kind of conversations. When our small group meets on Wednesday nights, Rosanna and I's small group, this is a place of love. We open the scriptures together. It's a place of truth. It's a place of grace. It's a place of, sometimes there's things we need to say to each other in love. I mean, this is the place. Because what did Jesus say? If you do this, they will know you by your love for one another. It would have been way easier if he said, you'll be known by your beliefs. So just read a lot of books. But he says, no, it's how you love one another. The old system essentially said when you go to church, it's all about making peace with God. That's the whole point. You go to church, to the sacred place, to the sacred person, to the sacred system, to the sacred practices. It's all about making peace between you and God. That's the whole point of the whole thing. The new system, Jesus says, it's about this. It's about how well you and I are engaging, interacting with other people, and loving other people. Notice what Jesus says as he's describing this new thing. Matthew 5:23, I'll just throw it on the screens really quick. He says, therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar and you remember that your brother or sister has something against you. In other words, if you're at church and you realize that you and somebody else, there's a conflict, I want you to leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them and then come back to God and offer your gift. How awkward is that? Have you ever even seen anybody do that in church? Like in the middle of the worship song, man, or in the middle of the offering, somebody's like, oh man, there's Tina across the building. And I realized her and I had a big blow up a couple weeks ago at the hair salon, and I got to get over there and talk. No, you never see people do that. It's awkward. But Jesus is essentially saying this: there is a new measuring stick and metric for your spiritual health. And it's not how long you pray, although that's a great thing to do. It's not how many verses you know, although that's a great thing to do. It's how well you love visible people. How well you make peace, how well you engage, how healthy your relationships are. That's the new thing. And so church eventually has to go beyond the door to the table. And you see this 100 times exactly in the New Testament. You see the words one another next to each other. 100 times you see that, one another. Sometimes it says love one another, serve one another, give to one another, carry one another's burdens. There's 100 of those one another verses, and that's what church is. That's what on Wednesday nights when our group meets and throughout the week when we interact together, I'm telling you, it's about getting together to one another. That's the whole point. They will know you by your love for one another. Love has to be the main thing, and sometimes that's best expressed at the table. Something incredible has happened in our church in the last year and a half. Sermons, songs can't do this, but this is just incredible to me. A year and a half ago, we had 29 life groups that met throughout this city throughout the week, which is incredible. 29 life groups is incredible, but we have moved from 29 life groups to 74 life groups that meet throughout the city throughout the week, and that's amazing. And that's you, and that's many of you stepping up to the plate of leadership and saying, I think God can use me as a leader. And we want that for everybody in our church. We want everybody to experience love and grace, not just from God, but from people. And that happens at the table. And we want everybody to experience that as a church. How many of us have ever eaten at a farm-to-table restaurant? Anybody? Anybody been to Portland before? Yeah. Well, as a church, we're a table-to-farm kind of church. And what we mean by that is that, yes, we meet in holy huddles and we inspire, equip one another, but it at the same time becomes about getting in the garden and getting our hands dirty. And it's about everyone has a role to play and contributing and doing something, a sacrificial act of love that builds God's kingdom. The garden's the place where you get your hands dirty. Or it's not just about your beliefs or your friends. It becomes about somebody outside the walls of the church, or maybe somebody in the next generation inside the walls of the church, that you're planting a seed in their heart. Right now, on the other side of the wall, there's hundreds of kids, some of them your kids, that are on the other side of this wall, and they're being inspired by leaders. And what is essentially happening in the heart of your son or daughter right now is that a leader who's working a full-time job, fully engaged in raising their own kids, their life, is planting a seed in somebody's heart. It's the garden. Sometimes it's inside the walls of the church when you pass out bulletins and you hand something to somebody who's never even been to church. By smiling at them, you are planting a seed, and all of us are needed in this and doing what God wants to do here. It's the garden. Sometimes it's outside the walls of the church. Sometimes it's Alabaster Jar Project, 114 survivors of human trafficking that have been helped through the work of those of you and the generosity of those of you in this church. Sometimes it's what we've talked about the last couple of weeks. We had a lunch this past Thursday of hundreds of you that came to say, hey, we want to help solve the food insecurity issue of 1 in 5 kids that are going to bed hungry in our city, in the Escondido and this down to South Poway, this area. We want to be engaged in that problem. We want to leverage what we have to plant a seed and to do something. Sometimes it's inside the walls of the church. The old system would have been a lot easier. The old system said, hey, your spirituality is defined based on how many books you've read. The new thing says it's based on how many people you have loved. This is what church is supposed to be. Love well, focus on that. That's the main thing. That's as deep as it gets. That's where the gold is for a church, when we begin to leverage what we have to love people. Notice what Paul says to the church at Corinth. He says it this way. He says, now these 3 remain. He's written on this long letter. He says, now these 3 remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these it's love. That means as a church, with whatever God has entrusted to us, people, time, talent, treasure, whatever, we have to leverage it to begin to solve problems in our community and to love our community. Because when the building is gone, the whole point is love. That's the one thing that remains. What you did in love, the seeds you planted in love, that's the one thing that remains. That's the whole point of the whole thing. This one thing called love actually remains. And what that means for us is that we take whatever we have and we leverage it to solve problems in our community. When the Church of Jesus Christ is firing on all cylinders, it's solving problems in its community faster than government can. And typically the response of people when you hear about a crisis or a problem, whether it's kids going to bed hungry, people go, well, somebody should do something about that. But when Christians hear that, they say, what's gonna solve that is not a law, although that would be good. What begins to solve that is love. When Christians begin to roll up their sleeves and get in the garden and leverage what they have, this one thing remains: love. That's the kind of church that I want to be a part of. That's what church is supposed to be. And that's as deep as it gets. At most churches, discipleship, if you want to get deeper in your faith, you buy a pack of highlighters and you take a class, for 12 weeks, and that's great. We offer environments like that. But in the New Testament, what we see modeled over and over again, it's not how many books you've read, it's not how many verses you know, although those things are wonderful and great. It's how well you love. This is the one thing that remains. And it just cycles back to our neighbors, our friends, our community that we keep inviting to the door. Family and people that are far from God who matter to God. And we invite them to the table and we invite them to the garden, and it just cycles back and it just cycles back to this thing. It's all built around this thing called love. And if we forget this, the church just goes back to the old system and becomes irrelevant. But if it keeps this one thing the main thing, this messy, awkward, often gray, don't know exactly what we're supposed to do, this thing called love, if this remains at the center, then the church, if this one thing remains, this thing called love, the church is the most powerful, unstoppable force that the world has ever known. And that's the kind of church that I want to be a part of. It's beautiful. Let's pray together. God, we thank you. This one thing remains. At the end of the day, God, it's this one thing called love. When you strip the old system of its power, when you put the temple out of business, you began to employ the saints. You began to employ the priests, the church. You began to employ this new thing. Then you said, if you just remember this one thing, the Church of Jesus Christ is going to advance forward in the world and be unstoppable. And for 2,000 years, God, the church, when it has remembered that its mission and its job is to love, it has rescued communities, it has saved cities, it has reshaped politics. But when it's forgotten it drifts into irrelevancy so fast. And I pray, Jesus, as the people of God, would we surrender to this thing called love? Would we ask today in our own life, when it comes to our neighbors, our friends, when it comes to people in our community group, when it comes to people on our street, would we ask, what is love demanding of me today? Well, what's the sacrifice that love is pulling me into? That's what you're interested in, God. It's a different step for every person in the building. But would we say yes to that invitation? It's in Jesus' name that we pray.